There is a particular kind of silence that follows a formal ultimatum, a silence that is not the absence of sound but the presence of expectation. The Joint War Authority had perfected that silence over 300 years of successful coercion. I had studied it in the briefing materials during the long transit to Vethara Station, reading accounts of the 19 species that had sat in that chamber before us and found themselves surrounded by it. 18 of them had capitulated. The 19th had ceased to exist as a sovereign entity within 2 orbital cycles. The compact kept the record clean by calling that last one a voluntary restructuring. I knew the silence was coming before the session opened. I had been a military attaché for 11 years and a soldier for 9 before that, and I had learned, by the time I was assigned to Ambassador Renata Voss's delegation, that the most dangerous rooms in the galaxy are the quiet ones. A room where someone is shouting is a room where someone has already lost control of the situation. A room where no one is making any sound at all is a room where someone believes the situation is already decided. The chamber of the Joint War Authority was exactly that kind of room. I want to be precise about the architecture, because the architecture was not accidental. Nothing built by the Sovereign Compact was accidental. Their civilization had been making deliberate choices about material symbols for 5 centuries, and the chamber on Vethara Station was a 300-year argument in stone and light. The floor was black marble quarried from the gravity-collapsed core of a planet whose people had refused to negotiate with the Compact in their 2nd decade of expansion. They had quarried it deliberately and laid it throughout the station's most important rooms. Every delegation that entered the chamber walked on that floor. The Compact's historians had written about the choice extensively. They were not subtle people. They believed that the weight of history, made literal, produced a specific psychological effect in those who walked across it. The ceiling was a glass dome, enormous, the panels thick enough to survive a direct hull breach in the station's outer ring. Through it, in the pale blue of the planetary system's primary star, you could see the silhouettes of 3 Joint War Authority dreadnoughts maintaining station above the dock. They were not there for defensive purposes. The station had no external threats. They were there because 3 dreadnoughts, visible through glass while you negotiated, said something that no treaty language could say as efficiently. The tiered seating wrapped the chamber in a crescent, 7 rows, each row slightly higher than the one below it, so that the effect for anyone standing at the center table was that of being at the bottom of a bowl, surrounded on 3 sides by ranked faces. The Joint War Authority's senior members filled those tiers. I counted, in the minutes before the session opened, 83 individuals across the species represented on the council. Vethali, Sharketh, Andrani, Thuresi, 2 species I recognized only from photographs in the briefing materials, and 3 I did not recognize at all. Their robes were layered and ceremonial, each color and insignia a specific rank signal within the Compact's military hierarchy. The delegation from Andra wore deep burgundy with silver thread at the cuffs. The Vethali block sat in pale gray. The Thuresi filled the upper right tier in black with gold. Ambassador Voss sat at the table. I sat at her right hand. Our third, a trade specialist named Paul Kerv, who spoke 4 Compact dialects fluently and had asked, on the transit, whether I thought there was any possibility of the session ending favorably, sat at her left. I had told him that the session would end in a specific way, and that I was not certain favorable was the right metric by which to judge it. He had looked at me for a long moment and then looked out the transit window at the stars and had not asked me anything else. The chair of the Joint War Authority was a Vethali named Threshankarvan. He was old by Vethali standards. His cranial ridges had gone smooth, and his secondary eyelids barely moved when he blinked, which among his species indicated either calm or exhaustion, so profound it resembled calm. I could not tell which applied. He had been chair for 40 years. He had delivered 19 ultimatums in that time and had received 19 satisfactory resolutions. He was the kind of man who had been right so many times that he had stopped being able to imagine being wrong. It was, as I had noted in my own pre-session assessment, the most dangerous thing about him. Threshankarvan called the session to order with a single flat pulse from the baton at his station, not a sound precisely, but a frequency that moved through the chamber's floor and seats simultaneously, so that everyone present felt it in their skeleton at the same moment. It was a remarkable piece of engineering, that baton. It said, "We are all inside the same body right now, and I am its spine." He did not begin with pleasantries. The compact did not use pleasantries at Joint War Authority sessions, on the grounds that pleasantries implied uncertainty about the outcome, and the Joint War Authority did not experience uncertainty about outcomes. He said, and I will render it in the standard diplomatic translation, which Kerv was tracking on his embedded notation system, even as the interpretation reached our earpieces. He said, "The Sovereign Compact has convened this session of the Joint War Authority under Provision 17 of the Collective Defense Mandate. The subject before this chamber is the continued unauthorized deployment of Earth Expeditionary Fleet units within compact-adjacent space. The Chair recognizes that the human delegation has been provided, in advance of this session, with the complete technical record of violations documented by compact boundary monitoring over the preceding 22 rotations. The Chair recognizes further that the human delegation has had 14 standard rotations to prepare a remediation proposal. The Chair expects that proposal now." He stopped. The silence came in behind his last word exactly the way I had expected it to. I had heard those words, or something very like them, in 3 different briefing recordings before the transit. The compact's procedure was formalized to a degree that made their ultimatum sessions almost liturgical. There was a text. There was a prescribed sequence. The parties across the table were expected to perform their assigned roles within it, and the compact's 500-year track record suggested they had selected for roles, in the species they dealt with, that moved in predictable directions. Ambassador Voss did not produce a remediation proposal. She had brought a document case, a flat, sealed panel the size of a large data tablet, which she had set on the table when she sat down and had not touched since. She did not open it now. She folded her hands on the surface in front of her and looked at Threshankarvan across 40 meters of black marble floor and said nothing. The silence extended. In the tiers, I watched the Vethali block. They were the compact's senior members in this chamber, and they were also, in my assessment, the ones most likely to signal first when something was moving outside the script. 3 of them exchanged glances within the first 12 seconds of Voss's silence, a quick lateral movement of eyes that among Vethali carries the same weight as a raised eyebrow does for us. They had expected something. Not necessarily compliance, but something in the compliance direction. An open encounter. A procedural question about the technical record. A request for additional time. These were the moves the script allowed for, and Voss was not making any of them. Threshankarvan waited what I would estimate was 45 seconds before he spoke again. For a man conducting a formal ultimatum session, that was a significant pause. It told me he was recalibrating. "The Chair reiterates," he said, "that this session was convened under Provision 17, which carries binding resolution authority. The human delegation's failure to produce a remediation proposal at this stage of the session will be entered into the record as noncompliance. The Chair asks the human delegation to confirm its understanding of this consequence." Voss turned her head slightly and looked at me. This was the moment I had been brought to Vethara Station to handle. Not in the sense that I had been given authority over the delegation. Voss held that, and she exercised it with a precision that I had enormous respect for, but in the sense that the specific thing that needed to be said at this specific moment required a particular kind of person to say it. And Voss and I had agreed, in the hours before the session, that she would set the silence and I would fill it. And the thing I would fill it with was not a counter-proposal, not a procedural objection, and not an explanation. I leaned slightly forward and said, in standard diplomatic lingua that required no interpretation, "We already did." 4 words. I had chosen them carefully over several days, because the English language does not offer many 4-word constructions that carry 3 separate meanings simultaneously, and I needed all 3. The first meaning was literal. We had already stood the fleet down, not pulled it back, stood it down within compact adjacent space, repositioned it, which is a very different maneuver. The fleet had moved. The compact's boundary monitoring had, in fact, recorded the movement 22 rotations ago and had interpreted it as the first wave of a repositioning toward the boundary. Their documentation, which they had provided to us 14 rotations before this session, showed a fleet in motion. What it did not show, what their monitoring was not positioned to catch, was where the fleet had moved to. The second meaning was diplomatic. We already did meaning. We received your pre-session documentation 14 rotations ago. We understood exactly what it contained and what it implied, and we acted on our understanding at that time. Meaning, the remediation is complete. Meaning, we are not here to present a proposal. We are here because you called this session before checking whether the problem you convened it to address still existed. The third meaning was the one that would take the compact 6 rotations to fully understand, because it required them to re-examine 22 rotations of boundary monitoring data with a corrected interpretive framework and discover that what they had been watching was not a fleet repositioning toward the boundary, but a fleet repositioning through a gap in the boundary that their monitoring array had a 16% blind spot across. Due to the debris field from the Andrani expansion event 12 years prior, and that the fleet had not been moving out of compact adjacent space. It had been moving in. I set that thought aside in the same way I had set it aside every time it surfaced during the transit. There is a discipline to carrying a piece of information that will detonate on a specific schedule, and that discipline is not unlike the discipline of the soldier who has set a charge and withdrawn to the perimeter and simply waits. You do not revisit the calculation. You made the calculation. It was either correct or it wasn't. Revisiting it changes nothing and unsettles your face, which in a room like the chamber of the Joint War Authority is information you cannot afford to give away. My face was calm. It had been calm since I walked across the black marble floor. I had been practicing that particular calm for 9 months, since the first set of boundary monitoring intercepts had come through our intelligence channels, and the strategic picture had become clear enough to act on. Threshang Karvan was looking at me. His secondary eyelids had begun to move, which told me the exhaustion theory was probably correct. What I was seeing now was not calm, but the effort to produce the appearance of calm from a state that was becoming something else. "The chair requires clarification," he said. "The delegate's statement, 'we already did,' will be entered into the record. The chair asks the delegate to specify, stood the fleet down in what manner, to what position, confirmed by what observation point." "Rotational monitoring logs from our own stations," I said. "We can provide copies." "The compact's monitoring," he said, "shows the human fleet as of 22 rotations prior in active repositioning. The monitoring has not recorded a subsequent stand-down." "Your monitoring has a 16% coverage gap," I said. "The debris field from the Andrani expansion event. Your own survey teams documented it 12 years ago." He did not respond immediately. In the tears, the silence changed texture. The Vethali Block's 3 exchangers were no longer exchanging glances. They had gone still in a way that was distinct from the stillness of the session's opening. That opening stillness had been the stillness of a prepared position. This was a different thing. This was the stillness of a calculation running and not yet returning a result. I watched the Thuresi in the upper right tier. Of the compact's member species, the Thuresi had the most extensive direct experience with Earth's military programs, having been the party that formally requested the compact's intervention in the first place 18 months prior. They had brought a complaint to the Joint War Authority alleging unauthorized encroachment, and the Joint War Authority had spent 12 months building a case from monitoring data, and the case had looked very solid from inside the chamber's walls. The Thuressi representative, a heavy-set individual named something that translated approximately as first among advocates, had, at the session's opening, been sitting with the particular posture of someone who has done a great deal of work and expects to see it rewarded. That posture had shifted in the 60 seconds since I had spoken. He was leaning forward now just slightly, and his hands were no longer folded on his knee rest. They were open, resting flat against the robe fabric. An open hand among Thuressi is a stress indicator. He was working to conceal it. He was not fully succeeding. Threshankarvan said, "The debris field coverage gap is a known quantity in the compact's monitoring assessment. The compact's analysts account for it in their positional readings." "By interpolation," I said, "not by direct observation. Your analysts project positions through the gap based on prior trajectory and velocity data. Our fleet changed both." Another silence. The Andrani delegation, lower in the tiers and to my left, had not made a sound since the session opened. Of all the member species, the Andrani were the ones I had studied most carefully in the transit period, because the Andrani had been, 18 months prior, the most vocal proponents of a negotiated settlement with Earth before the Thuressi complaint had shifted the conversation. The Andrani had reasons, economic reasons primarily, related to the transit corridor agreements that the boundary dispute had suspended, to prefer a world in which Earth and the Compact found a resolution that did not involve Provision 17 proceedings. They were, in a narrow sense, the closest thing to a sympathetic party in those tiers. I had not expected anything useful from that sympathy. Sympathetic parties in a structure like the Joint War Authority do not vote against the chair. But I had noted their position, because in the aftermath of whatever the next 6 rotations produced, the shape of the Andrani's response would tell us something important about the compact's internal stability. The Sharketh bloc, 4 representatives in the second tier, wearing the pale green of their planetary council, had been the hardest for me to read throughout the session. The Sharketh have a facial structure that makes emotional interpretation extremely difficult for human observers. Their expressions are not carried in the musculature of the face in the way that most species are, but in a complex set of postural microadjustments, a degree of head tilt, the angle of the shoulder ridge, the specific tension in the hand tendons. I had studied them for months from recordings, and I could read them at roughly the level a child reads a text in an only partially familiar language, basic shapes, not nuance. What I read in the second tier during Threshankarvan's second silence was the Sharketh equivalent of looking at each other without looking at each other. It was a distributed attention, a collective awareness of something happening in the room that required assessment. The thing that was happening in the room was this. The chair of the Joint War Authority, who had delivered 19 ultimatums and received 19 satisfactory resolutions, had just been told that the fleet his ultimatum required us to stand down had already moved, and he did not know where it had moved to, and his monitoring coverage had a gap in it, and the party sitting across the black marble table from him had been aware of all 3 of these facts before walking into the session. I watched this understanding move through the chamber the way water moves through a porous material, not evenly, not all at once, but advancing along the paths of least resistance. The Vethali block first, because they were the sharpest. Then a ripple outward to the Thuressi, who had the most at stake and were therefore the most sensitized to threat. Then the Sharketh, methodical as always. Then the Andrani, who I suspected understood before I finished speaking, but were waiting to see how it resolved before committing a visible reaction. Threshankarvan said, more slowly than he had said anything else in the session, "The chair is going to request a recess." "Of course," Ambassador Voss said. It was the first thing she had said since the session opened. The recess lasted 4 hours. We were escorted to a chamber off the main floor, windowless, which I noted and said nothing about, and offered provisions that our delegation's standing protocol required us to decline on first offer in any session under Provision 17, because accepting provisions in a Provision 17 recess creates a record entry of having received the compact's hospitality, which carries specific legal weight in the written resolution framework. Kerv handled the decline with the appropriate formula. We sat, Voss read from her data panel. Kerv made notes. I watched the door and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill that took me years to develop and which I believe is one of the most undervalued capabilities in the diplomatic corps. When the session resumed, Threshankarvan looked different. It was not a dramatic change. The Vethali body does not announce distress the way a human body does, and he was a controlled individual by any standard, but there was a quality to his posture that had not been there before the recess. His primary eyelids were moving slightly faster than they had been. The smooth cranial ridges had taken on a faint flush. He had spent the 4 hours looking at the same monitoring data I was referencing, with the specific corrective framework I had introduced, and he had found what I knew he would find. He opened the resumed session with the required procedural language. Then he said, "The Compact's monitoring analysts have conducted an emergency reassessment of boundary data over the preceding 22 rotations, applying corrected trajectory modeling to account for the Andrani debris field gap. The assessment is not yet complete. The chair requests that the human delegation provide the coordinates of their fleet's current position." Ambassador Voss opened the document case she had brought. She removed a single sealed data carrier and set it on the table in front of her. She did not slide it across. She did not speak. She left it there. After a moment, a compact floor aide, a young Vethali in clerical gray, walked across the marble floor, took the carrier, and returned it to the chair's station. Threshankarvan opened it. He read what was inside. He read it for a long time. His secondary eyelids stopped moving. I want to be precise about what was in that carrier, because there has been some imprecision in the accounts that have circulated in the years since. The carrier did not contain a threat. It contained a fact. The fact was coordinates, the current position of the Earth Expeditionary Fleet's 1st and 3rd battle groups, expressed in the Compact's own standard notation, accurate to the last update we had received 6 hours before the session opened. Those coordinates placed both battle groups inside compact-adjacent space, not at its boundary, not approaching the boundary, not visible to boundary monitoring, inside. Alongside the coordinates was a single explanatory line, repositioned through the Andrani debris corridor, rotations 22 through 17, now holding station pending resolution. That was all. No demands, no ultimatum language, no list of conditions, pending resolution and a set of coordinates. The chamber was very quiet. Threshankarvan did not look up from the carrier for what I estimate was 2 full minutes. He was not reading. He had finished reading. He was sitting with the information, doing with it what any intelligent being does when they receive a fact that is irreconcilable with everything they believed about their position in the room. He was finding the place where the mistake had been made, tracing it backward, looking for the moment at which the script had diverged from the reality. I could have told him. I was familiar with the moment. It had been the Thuracy complaint, 18 months prior, the formal filing with the Joint War Authority alleging unauthorized encroachment by Earth's expeditionary units in the Andrani transit corridors. That filing had been accurate as far as it went. The encroachment had happened. What the Thuracy filing had not contained, because the Thuracy had not known it, was the reason. The reason was the debris corridor. Earth's survey teams had been mapping the Andrani debris field for 6 years, under a standard astrophysical research charter that gave us access to the region under a scientific cooperation provision that predated the current boundary dispute by a decade. During those 6 years, The survey teams had found something that our monitoring analysts had subsequently worked to confirm. The debris field had a navigable corridor through it, approximately 800 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, that passed through the compact's boundary monitoring array's 16% blind spot and emerged on the far side inside compact adjacent space. The corridor had been mapped, the transit time through it had been calculated. The question of whether a military formation of the right configuration could make the transit without triggering boundary alerts had been tested with survey vessels first and then, over the preceding 14 months, with elements of the expeditionary fleet transiting singly and in small groups during scheduled monitoring maintenance windows that the compact published in advance as a courtesy to commercial traffic. By the time the Thuresi filed their complaint, we had used the corridor 87 times. The complaint had been the signal we were waiting for, not because it changed our tactical position, but because it started a clock. A formal Provision 17 proceeding had a defined schedule, 12 months to case construction, a required 14-rotation precession notification, the session itself. We had known from the day the complaint was filed that this session would happen on this date in this chamber. We had planned accordingly. The fleet had gone through the corridor in the preceding 22 rotations, not one element at a time. The whole of the first and third battle groups, timed across a sequence of maintenance windows and debris corridor transits that our analysts had been planning for 11 months. By the time the precession notification reached us 14 rotations before this session, the bulk of the transit was complete. By the time Threshankarvan called the session to order, the fleet was already inside. He had issued an ultimatum to stand down a fleet that was no longer where his monitoring thought it was. We had already done it. We had stood it down at the boundary from one side of the boundary, and then we had stood it back up on the other side. The chamber was still very quiet. One of the Sharketh in the second tier asked, in a voice that was carefully controlled. I read it as controlled because the specific microtension in their shoulder ridge was one I had identified from recordings as an effort posture, the data carrier, the coordinates. You are saying that your fleet's current position is inside compact space, not at the boundary. Inside. Inside, I confirmed. For how long? As of the data in the carrier, I said, the first battle group has been in position for 4 rotations, the third battle group for 3. Silence. You transited the Andrani corridor, said the Sharketh delegate. We did. During monitoring maintenance windows. The published maintenance schedule was available to any party with a commercial traffic advisory subscription. We have held one for 8 years. The Thuresi representative, first among advocates, said something in his own language that the interpretation system rendered as an emphatic negative. Not a word precisely, but a sound category that the system mapped to a human emotional register of profound refusal to accept a piece of information. His hands were open on his robe. They had been open since approximately the point at which Threshankarvan's secondary eyelids stopped moving. Threshankarvan set the data carrier down. He said, and I will record this precisely because it is what the title of this account refers to, and because I want anyone reading this to understand that it was not a panic statement. It was a deliberate, measured, formal statement delivered by a man who had governed a Provision 17 chamber for 40 years, and was now performing the function of a man who had governed a Provision 17 chamber for 40 years, and had just discovered that the architecture of the situation was not what he had believed it to be when he called the session to order, he said. The chair requires clarification of the human delegation's intentions. Ambassador Voss looked at him for a moment. Then she said, the fleet holds. 3 words. Not a threat. A statement of fact about a current status. The fleet holds. It is in position. It has been in position. It is continuing to hold its position pending resolution per the note in the carrier. Threshain Carvan said. The compact did not authorize transit through Andrani-adjacent space. The scientific cooperation provision, I said, authorizes research transit. We have been conducting research in the debris field for 6 years under that provision. The provision does not specify the composition of the transit party. He looked at me for a long moment. Research, he said. We surveyed the corridor, I said, extensively. Another silence. In the tiers, I could see various members of the council doing the same thing Threshain Carvan had done, finding the moment at which the script had diverged, tracing it back. It was a slow process, and it was not going to produce comfortable conclusions. The scientific cooperation provision predated the current boundary dispute by a decade, and had been negotiated under a joint treaty commission that no longer existed in its original form, and its language was general enough that contesting it under the current framework would take years of legal work, while the fleet held its position inside compact space. The Andrani representative in the lower tier, a small individual whose species body language I could not read with any confidence, made a sound that the interpretation system rendered as a request for floor recognition. Threshain Carvan gave it. The Andrani said, the delegation from Andra would note, for the record, that the scientific cooperation provision was in part originated by the Andrani Treaty Compact of 14 years prior, under which Earth's research teams first gained access to the debris field region. The Andrani delegation would further note that this chamber's focus, at the current moment, should perhaps be redirected from the historical legal question to the practical strategic question, which is, what resolution does the human delegation propose? It was, diplomatically, a remarkable intervention. I had not anticipated it specifically. I had noted the Andrani as the sympathetic party and had expected some form of moderating influence from them eventually, but the precision of the move surprised me. The Andrani delegate had, in about 40 words, done 3 things. Insulated Andra from any legal blowback from the provision's use, redirected the chamber away from a defensive posture that would harden the situation, and invited the human delegation to name terms. I had a brief, involuntary respect for the Andrani. They were good at this. Ambassador Voss said, the suspension of the transit corridor restrictions. The chamber received that sentence in silence. The suspension of the transit corridor restrictions, Voss continued, that have been applied to Earth's expeditionary units under the provisional boundary framework established at the Vethara Accords. We want to transit freely. We have been transiting freely. We would prefer to do so under an acknowledged framework rather than under a research provision that requires us to send survey vessels in advance. Threshain Carvan said, the Vethara Accords represent the foundational boundary framework for the entire compact-adjacent region. Suspension of those provisions is not within the authority of this chamber to grant unilaterally. We know, Voss said, which is why the fleet holds. We're not asking this chamber to grant it. We're asking this chamber to recommend it to the full compact assembly. A distinction, a very precise distinction. The Joint War Authority had no authority to rewrite the Vethara Accords, but it had the authority, in fact, under Provision 17, the obligation to report its findings and recommendations to the full assembly, which did have that authority. Voss was not asking Threshain Carvan to exceed his mandate. She was asking him to exercise it in a specific direction. She was also asking him while a human fleet held position inside compact space, which focused the mind considerably. The session recessed twice more before the day closed. I spent most of those recesses in the same windowless room, doing the same thing I had done in the first recess, sitting, watching the door, thinking about nothing in particular. Kerv had stopped trying to make conversation with me sometime around the second recess. Voss worked steadily through whatever she was reading on her data panel, occasionally making a note, occasionally not. She had been this way in every session I had worked with her, entirely elsewhere in her mind until the moment she was needed, and then entirely present. I had worked with diplomatic principals who used recesses to process anxiety, to project confidence at their staff, to second-guess decisions already made. Voss did not do any of these things. She made notes and she waited. On the third recess, Kerv asked me quietly whether I thought it was going the way we had planned. "It's going the way we prepared," I said. He considered that. "Is there a difference?" "Planning is what you do before the variables introduce themselves," I said. "Preparation is what you do so the variables don't matter which way they go." He thought about that for a moment and then nodded and went back to his notes. The third and final day of the session was different in its texture from the first. On the first day, the chamber had been full of the specific energy of a body that believed itself in control of the sequence of events. On the third day, that energy had been replaced by something I can only describe as a careful attention to what was real. A collective reassessment, not hostile, not resigned, but genuinely engaged with the shape of the situation as it actually existed rather than as the Provision 17 script prescribed it. Threshankarvan opened the third day with a procedural statement that departed from the standard text in one specific way. He did not invoke the time limit language from Provision 17 that would have put the human delegation on a countdown to punitive action. In 40 years of sessions, he had always invoked it by the third day. The fact that he did not invoke it now was the clearest signal I had received from him that the recess work had produced the conclusion I had expected it to produce. The Andrani delegate had clearly been working during the second recess as well. He was the first to speak after Threshankarvan's opening, and what he said, in precise and formal diplomatic standard, was a proposal that the Joint War Authority prepare a findings report to the full Compact Assembly recommending the establishment of a joint transit working group, with representation from Earth, the Compact, and all affected treaty parties, to draft revised corridor access provisions under the existing framework. The word suspension did not appear in his proposal. Neither did the phrase corridor restrictions. He was offering a process that would reach the same conclusion Voss had asked for without requiring anyone in the chamber to say explicitly that they were agreeing to it. I had not prepared for this specific language. I had prepared for this outcome. Voss said, "The human delegation can support a working group process." She said nothing else. The Thuresi representative, first among advocates, spent the following 30 minutes attempting to introduce language that would have required the fleet to reposition to the boundary before the working group convened. The Sharketh delegate, with a careful precision that I respected, observed that repositioning the fleet was a matter for the working group to address as part of its terms of engagement, and that presupposing its outcome would undermine the process before it began. First among advocates argued. The Sharketh delegate held the line. Threshankarvan, notably, did not intervene on the Thuresi's behalf. The session closed with a procedural resolution directing the chair to prepare a findings report recommending the establishment of the working group. It was not the full suspension of the corridor restrictions. It was the beginning of a process that would produce a framework that would contain the suspension as its practical outcome, provided the working group operated in good faith, and provided the fleet remained where it was, which was a very effective incentive to good faith. We walked out across the black marble floor, the floor that had been laid from the ruins of a people who had refused to negotiate. I had been thinking about that floor since the first day, and in the 40 meters between the table and the door, I thought about it one more time. The Compact had built that floor to produce a specific psychological effect. It had probably worked for many of the delegations that had walked across it. It had not worked for us, not because we were immune to symbolic architecture, but because we had walked in with a different set of numbers in our heads than the architecture was designed to address. When you know the floor is there to tell you that you are standing on someone else's defeat, you walk across it and think about your own coordinates instead. The fleet held for 11 more rotations, while the working group's terms were negotiated. The final framework suspended the corridor restrictions for Earth's expeditionary units under a mutual access arrangement that gave the compact nominal inspection rights at transit entry and exit points, which in practice meant that their inspection vessels would be logging our transits. A concession we had built into our planning from the beginning, because an acknowledged framework, even one with inspection provisions, is operationally superior to an unacknowledged one. You can plan around acknowledged constraints. Unacknowledged positions require you to keep surveying. I was not present for the final working group session. I had returned to my own post by then, a desk in a building on a station that does not appear in the compact's public record because it does not need to. There is a specific kind of work that is done in rooms with no windows, and I have spent enough of my career in them to know that the work done in those rooms is often the work that makes the sessions in the domed chambers possible. I heard the final outcome from Kerv, who had stayed on for the working group process and who sent me a brief note when it concluded. The note contained the resolution language and one additional line. Threshankarvan signed it without comment. I thought about that. 40 years of sessions, 19 resolutions, a career built on the disciplined application of predictable pressure to predictable parties in a predictable sequence. He had built something real and effective, and he had run it with genuine skill. And then he had sat across a table from people who had read his monitoring gap before he had read it himself. And he had signed a resolution in a room where 3 dreadnoughts hung in the glass dome sky and were doing nothing because there was nothing left for them to do. I don't know what he felt, I know what he signed. I know also what the record shows if you pull the Joint War Authorities session archives for that date and read them in full. The record shows a provision 17 preceding that reached resolution. It shows a findings report recommending a working group. It shows the working group's output. It shows the signatures. What the record does not show, what no record in the Chamber's archives will ever fully render, is the 4 hours of the first recess, and what Threshankarvan was doing during those 4 hours, which was applying his analyst's corrected framework to 22 rotations of boundary monitoring data and finding, one data point at a time, the shape of what we had done. He found the 87 prior corridor transits. He found the maintenance window timing. He found the survey records filed under the scientific cooperation provision, which were public records, openly available, which no one in the compact's analytical apparatus had thought to read as a prelude to military planning, because research charters and military planning occupy different categories in most institutional minds, and the compact's institutions were very old and very accustomed to those categories remaining separate. He found all of it. I assume he found all of it, because he was an intelligent man and he had 4 hours, and because when the session resumed his secondary eyelids had stopped moving and he had asked, with great precision, a question about our intentions rather than a question about our position. A man who asks about intentions has already conceded the position. I have been asked in the years since whether I think we were wrong to do it the way we did it, the corridor transits, the maintenance windows, the research charter, the session itself arriving to find the fleet already in place. Whether we should have declared the corridor, made the transit openly, asked for a framework revision through normal treaty channels before moving the fleet. The honest answer is, we tried, not for the full 11 months of the corridor preparation, but before that. 2 years before the Thuracy complaint, Earth's diplomatic office filed a formal request with the Joint Transit Commission for a review of the corridor restriction provisions under the Vethara Accords. The request was received, acknowledged, logged, and placed in a review queue. It remained in that queue for 19 months without action. The Thuracy complaint, when it came, moved faster through the Joint War Authorities process in 12 months than our review request had moved in the preceding 19. I note this not as a grievance but as a data point. The compact system responds to specific kinds of pressure at specific kinds of speeds. Our request, filed through normal channels, moved at one speed. The situation we created moved at a different speed. We chose the situation that moved faster because 11 months of corridor preparation and 3 days of session is faster, in the relevant measure, than 2 years of waiting, and then a provision 17 proceeding on terms dictated by someone else's complaint. Efficiency is not the same as aggression. Speed is not the same as hostility. The fleet was never pointed at a compact world. It held position and it held its fire, because the point was never to threaten the compact's civilian populations. The point was to demonstrate in terms that the Joint War Authorities framework would recognize that Earth's position had changed since the Vethara Accords were written, and that the framework needed to change with it. We chose to demonstrate it in the one language the Chamber was guaranteed to understand, because it was the language the Chamber itself had built its entire authority on, the language of a fleet in position and a willingness to hold. The corridor is open now, has been for 6 years. Our transit vessels log their entries and exits at the inspection points, and the compact's vessels log the entries and exits on their side, and occasionally, in the early years, one of their inspection observers would ride along for a section of the transit, which we allowed under the framework terms and which produced, I am told, some interesting conversations between their observers and our transit crews. The observers expected to find something alarming about the inside of a human military transport, and what they found was a working ship with a crew that had jobs to do. Alarming, perhaps, in its own way, the thoroughness of it, the preparation evident in the material and the personnel, but not alarming in the way they had been expecting. I think often about Threshan Karvan. He retired, I know, 18 months after the session, earlier than his stated intention had been, though the official record describes it as a planned transition. He published a monograph, which I obtained through our academic exchange channels, on the evolution of the Joint War Authorities procedural framework. The monograph is thoughtful and detailed and says nothing directly about the session, though it has a chapter on the limitations of boundary monitoring systems in debris field environments that I found remarkably candid. He did not name us in the chapter. He did not need to. The chapter named the problem precisely, and anyone who had read the session record would know exactly which instance he was describing. I read the monograph twice. The second time I read it as he had probably written it as a communication to the institution he had served, in the only language that institution would act on, documented precedent. He was telling his successors, without saying so, what had happened and what it meant for the framework. He was, in his own methodical way, making sure the chamber would be harder to walk a fleet past the next time someone tried it. I respect that. I respected it when I read it, and I respect it now. The man did his job well, including the part of his job that required him to acknowledge, in a form that would survive him, that a gap had existed and had been used. There is a version of this account that would frame what we did as a great victory, a masterwork of strategic patience, an illustration of humanity's particular genius for finding the angle that no one else in the room had considered. I am skeptical of that framing, not because it is inaccurate but because it is incomplete. We did not find the corridor because we are smarter than the compact. We found it because we had been surveying the debris field for 6 years on a charter that predated the dispute, and because 6 years of survey data, processed by people who knew what they were looking for, produces a different picture than 6 years of survey data processed by people who are looking for astrophysical phenomena. We were looking for a path, we found one, we used it. The thing that made the session work, the thing that reduced the whole elaborate machinery of the Joint War Authorities Provision 17 proceeding to a recess and a working group, was not the corridor and it was not the fleet. It was the timing. We had been ready before they called the session. The session's own schedule, the 12 months of case construction, the 14 rotation pre-session notification, had given us a precise countdown to work from. We knew the date. We planned to the date. The fleet was inside before the session opened. The ultimatum, when it came, was 6 rotations too late. That is the thing I want the record to reflect, because it is the thing most accounts of this session miss. The Joint War Authority's ultimatum was real. It was backed by genuine authority and by 3 dreadnoughts through the dome glass and by 40 years of Threshankarvan's track record. It was not a bluff. If we had been where they thought we were, it would have worked exactly as intended. We were not where they thought we were. We already did. The phrase has followed me since that session. I have heard it quoted back to me by people who were not in the chamber, people who read the session transcript and extracted it as the key line, the moment at which the direction became clear. They treat it as a tactical declaration, which it was. They sometimes treat it as a clever turn of phrase, which I did not intend it to be. I chose the 4 words because they were precise. Precision, in a chamber built on the language of ultimatums, is its own form of force. What I was saying in those 4 words was, we knew your schedule, we moved on your schedule, we were already done before you called the session. What I was saying was, the situation is not what your monitoring told you it was. What I was saying was, the decision you made 18 months ago when you convened this proceeding started a clock, and the clock ran down while you were building your case. You called the session too late. We already did. I walked out of that chamber across the black marble floor and through the doors and into the corridor of Vethara Station, and Paul Kerv fell into step beside me and said nothing for 37 seconds by my count, and then he said, "Did it go the way we prepared?" And I said, "Yes." And that was all that needed to be said. I have been trying, in writing this account, to be honest about the parts that were not clean. The corridor transit preparation was 11 months of sustained deception, not outright lying, but the sustained maintenance of a silence about what we were doing and why. The survey teams knew they were mapping a military transit route. The charter said research. The 2 things were not mutually exclusive. We were doing research, genuine astrophysical survey work, and the corridor mapping was a product of that research. But the research charter had not been filed with the intent to produce astrophysical publications. It had been filed with the intent to produce a path through a monitoring gap, and the astrophysical publications that resulted from 6 years of debris field study were real and were peer-reviewed, and were cited, and were also a secondary output of an operation whose primary output was the 87 corridor transits. I am not certain this was wrong. I am certain it was not clean. The compact's own behavior in the same period was not clean either. The Thuresi complaint had been filed with the Joint War Authority before it had been shared with Earth through any normal diplomatic channel. We learned of it from our own intelligence services, not from a formal notification. The 12 months of case construction had included the assembly of monitoring data that was selectively edited to exclude the maintenance window periods when our transit activity would have been hardest to misread. I do not know whether the editing was deliberate or whether it was a product of the compact's analytical categories, simply not capturing what they were not looking for. It may have been both simultaneously, which is frequently how institutional oversights operate. What I know is that when Threshankarvan said, in the resumed session, that the compact's analysts account for the debris field gap by interpolation, he was correct. They did account for it, and the interpolation was built on trajectory and velocity data from the surveillance periods, not the maintenance windows. The gap was in the data, not in the methodology. The methodology was sound. The data was incomplete, and the incompleteness was, in part, a product of how the compact's monitoring publication system worked, which published maintenance windows for commercial benefit without categorizing the data gaps they created as gaps in the surveillance record. The compact had, in a narrow technical sense, published the vulnerability itself. It was in their own commercial traffic advisories, available to any subscription holder for 8 years. We subscribed on the 9th year of the Science Charter, because by then we knew what we were looking for. This is the thing that I think Threshankarvan spent those 4 recess hours confronting, the realization that the gap had been published. That the instrument by which we had navigated it, the commercial traffic advisory subscription, was a system his own chamber had authorized. That the legal scaffolding on which the 87 transits rested, the Science Charter provision, was a framework his own predecessor chairs had agreed to in a different era without imagining that someone would use it for this purpose. He was not the victim of cleverness from outside the system. He was the inheritor of decisions made inside the system, decisions that had seemed unrelated to the problem at hand, decisions whose second-order implications had not been traced. That is an uncomfortable thing to sit with, and it is uncomfortable in a specific way that is distinct from losing to an adversary who outmaneuvered you. Because you can prepare against adversaries who outmaneuver you, and you cannot easily prepare against the accumulated weight of your own institution's prior choices. I think that is part of what he was writing about in the debris field chapter of his monograph. Not just the tactical lesson for future monitoring deployment, the institutional lesson, the question of which of your own published frameworks are invisible vulnerabilities that you have not yet found because no one has tried them at scale. The question of what else is in the commercial traffic advisories that someone with the right research charter and 11 months of preparation could make into something you did not anticipate. It is a question I think about in my own work, from the other side of it. We found the gap in their system. We should expect that someone else, in some system we have built, is finding a gap in ours. This is not paranoia. It is the appropriate epistemic humility of a person who has once been the one finding the gap and knows, therefore, that gaps exist in all systems, and that the people who find them are not always the ones you expected. Ambassador Voss retired 2 years after the session. She went back to the academic position she had held before the diplomatic posting, a chair in treaty law at one of the major institutions, where I understand she now teaches a seminar on framework negotiation that has a waiting list of several years. I have been told by people who have taken the seminar that it does not include the Vethara corridor session in its curriculum, though it does include a case study described only as the debris field problem, which students are asked to analyze without being told who the parties were. The case study asks students to identify the moment at which the procedural framework diverged from the practical situation, and to propose 3 different paths by which either party could have resolved the divergence earlier. I have been told the most common student answer, for the path not taken by the chair, is that the chair should have verified the fleet's position before calling the session. This is correct. It is also the kind of correction that is obvious in retrospect and was not obvious at the time, because verifying the fleet's position required knowing that the position might have changed in a direction that the monitoring system was not covering, which required knowing about the gap, which required someone to have looked at the debris field from the perspective of a party trying to find a path through it rather than a phenomenon trying to study. The session happened because no one in the compact's chamber had thought to look at the debris field from that angle. I do not say this to diminish what they did. They built and maintained a monitoring system of genuine sophistication, and they administered it through a chamber whose procedural framework had resolved 19 prior Provision 17 proceedings without issue. The gap was real, but it was not obvious, and the failure to find it before we found it was not a failure of intelligence or diligence. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to inhabit, even briefly, the perspective of someone who needed to get through rather than someone tasked with keeping others from getting through. That failure of imagination is the thing I find most instructive about the session, looking back. Not the corridor, not the timing, not the session itself, which was in the end a formal proceeding that produced a formal resolution through a formal process, the way those proceedings are supposed to work. The instructive thing is the 18 months of prior opportunity to notice, and the specific reason that noticing did not happen. I have spent the years since trying to apply that lesson to my own work, trying to ask, of every system I operate within or alongside, what someone who needed to get through it would see that I, standing on the inside maintaining it, am not seeing. It is an uncomfortable question. It does not produce comfortable answers, but it produces honest ones, and in the work I do, honest answers about the shape of the situation are more useful than comfortable ones about the shape we wish it had. The fleet came home 3 months after the working group concluded its framework. The first and third battle groups transited back through the corridor under the new acknowledged access provisions, logged at the compact's inspection points, noted in the commercial traffic advisories, this time with a different category code, one that had not existed before the working group created it. The category code is listed in the compact's current monitoring registry as Class 7 Transit, authorized under the Vethara Corridor Access Framework, with inspection provisions under Article 9. Class 7. 7 rotations after the category was created, a compact commercial hauler filed the first non-Earth application for Class 7 access, citing the debris field corridor as a viable shortcut for their transit route between two of the compact's own inner systems. The corridor, once documented and acknowledged, turned out to be useful for more than military transit. The hauler's application was approved. 14 more commercial applications followed within the year. The corridor is now, as I understand it, a moderately busy transit route with 6 registered regular users and approximately 40 occasional ones. The debris field remains. The stars on the other side of it remain. The monitoring gap remains, technically, though it is now a documented gap with an acknowledged transit lane through it, and inspection points at both ends, which makes it a different kind of gap than the one we used. A gap in a wall that has a door in it is not the same thing as a gap in a wall that no one knows about. I walked across the black marble floor of the Joint War Authority chamber, and I did not look down at it. I was thinking about the coordinates in the data carrier, and about the maintenance window schedule, and about the forewords, and about Paul Kerv's question on the transit, and about the answer I had given him, which I believed then and believe now. Did it go the way we prepared? Yes. That is the whole of the answer, yes. We prepared for a very specific situation, and we arrived at the session, and the situation was the one we had prepared for, and we handled it the way we had prepared to handle it, and it resolved the way we had worked to resolve it. There is no drama in that sentence. There is no triumph in it. It is a description of the outcome of 11 months of methodical work applied to a problem that required methodical work to resolve, and the resolution was what the work was designed to produce. We knew the floor was black marble from a destroyed world. We knew about the 3 dreadnoughts in the dome. We knew the silence that followed a formal ultimatum. We had read every account of every prior Provision 17 session, and we had found the gap in the boundary monitoring, and we had moved the fleet through it before the session opened. And when the chair asked for a remediation proposal, we did not produce one. We told him we already did. And then we waited for him to understand what that meant. He understood in the end. They all did. That is the only thing worth saying about the session that has not already been said. The chamber understood, and the working group was formed, and the framework was written, and the corridor was opened, and the fleet came home. Everything else is detail.